Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, then just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and sign up to be a patron there. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 34, episode 8. The Battle of Megiddo from Thutmose III to World War I, Part 2. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet, and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast, as well as a regular writer for us here. Our best source for Thutmose's Battle of Megiddo are the Annals of Thutmose, an account kept by his scribe Tjaneni, and then almost 20 years later inscribed into the interior walls of the sanctuary of the temple to Amun-Re at Karnak. There are other sources too. These were official documents, however, and we must be wary of 15th century BC spin. The traditional date of the battle is usually given as 1479 BC, but it is much more likely to date to 1457 BC. Whichever year it was the 23rd year of Thutmose's reign. From what we can understand, however, there are several parallels between Thutmose's battle and that fought in 1918, almost 3,500 years later. The Annals give us certain details which there is no reason to doubt, such as its opening that Thutmose commanded that his victories be recorded together with the booty brought back from his victorious campaigns. Beginning with the campaign in year 22 of his reign, Thutmose went on campaigns 17 times. It is the second of these in year 23 which concerns us. Thutmose III spent the first 22 years of his reign under the co-regency of his mother, Shepsut, 1507 to 1458 BC, coming to sole rule only in 1458 BC. He lost no time in launching military campaigns to reassert Egyptian authority and of new conquest. The ruler or king of Kadesh had organized a confederation of tribes and cities to join him in opposing Egyptian rule in the buffer zone of Amaru, located between the Egyptian Empire and that of the Hittites in modern-day Turkey and northern Syria. The ruler of Kadesh gathered allies from the surrounding areas of Syria, Aram, and Canaan, and centered on the city of Megiddo. Its prince also joined the alliance, probably as a major participant. Assembly at the Egyptian border with Canaan at the fortress of Tjaru, later Sele in Greek, and perhaps to be identified with modern Tel el Habua near Kantara, Egypt, on the military road. Thutmose marched north. The annals tell us that in the first month of summer, day 4, Thutmose arrived at the city of Gaza and left the following day to overthrow that wretched enemy to extend the borders of Egypt. He was both punishing rebels and on an expedition of new conquests. On day 16, 11 days later, Thutmose arrived at the town of Yehem. Yehem or Yaham is possibly the large city En-Esur or Tel-Esur or Tel el Asawir on the northern Sharon plain, just north of the Manash Heights, and at the starting point of the Aruna Road through the Mount Carmel range, although it has also been identified as the village of Kafr Yama, one of 4 villages which now make up modern Zemer, located a further 10 kilometers south of En-Esur. An archaeological report in 2013 reiterated this identification of the site. The extent of En-Esur, however, the largest fortified city in the area, larger than Megiddo, suggests it is more likely. This area south of the Mount Carmel range and on the Sharon plain would have made a far better comparison with Allenby's battle. Indeed, the breakthrough was called the Battle of Sharon. Megiddo, of course, carried more weight as a comparison. Another inscription of Thutmose III from Hermonthis in Egypt, modern Armant, records that the army arrived at Jamnia or Jebne, modern Yavne, Israel, on the coast before heading inland to Yehem. According to the Annals, Thutmose ordered a consultation with his valiant army, saying, "That wretched foe of Kadesh has come and entered into Megiddo, and is there at this moment. He has gathered to him the prince of all the foreign lands that had been loyal to Egypt, as well as those from as far of Narin, consisting of Kor and Kedi, their horses, their armies, their people. And he says it is reported, I shall wait and fight his majesty here in Megiddo. Now tell me what you think." This list of the enemies assembled is added to at the end of the inscription, and so we find named the ruler of Kadesh, the prince of Megiddo, the rulers of Narin, Kor, Kedi, and from the end of the document those of Yanoam, Inujes, and Herenkeru. There may well have been others. Marian warriors are named too. According to Eric Klein, Thutmose's army numbered between 10,000 and 20,000 men, whereas those of the confederation aligned against him are estimated at between 10,000 and 15,000 men. It might be expected at this point that Thutmose's army would clamour for battle and encourage their pharaoh to punish the rebels. The annals, however, take a peculiar turn, recording that the army was extremely cautious, warning Thutmose that the central road narrowed and that progress would only be possible in single file. What is more, they stated that numerous enemies were waiting beyond it. They worried that, given the narrowness of the passage, the vanguard would be fighting, while the rearguard had yet to depart Aruna, where the pass began. They reported that there were two other possibilities of roads which could be taken. One came out at Karnak, and the other at Jefeti, which came out north of Megiddo in the Quina Valley. Both were longer but safer routes. They ended their response saying, "May our valiant lord proceed on whichever of these seems best to him. Do not make us go on that difficult road." Such a lukewarm reception, bordering on opposition, is entirely unexpected, not to mention dangerous under a pharaoh. We might note, however, that there were 3 roads which the army told Thutmose he could take, and that he should avoid the difficult one. This is a parallel with Allenby's plan of 3 attacks on the railway against the 8th Army and against the 7th and 4th Army. 2 of these were diversionary, although unlike Thutmose III, Allenby's main attack was in the western site, whereas Thutmose would make his in the centre. The probable locations of Thutmose's line of march and battle show just how few of those sites were shared in common with Allenby's battle. Gaza was a site important to both, but it was only the Jezreel Valley in general which needed to be crossed, which the 2 battles shared. Yehem must have been a place from which all 3 potential routes to Megiddo could depart, but the Aruna road was the most direct, if most dangerous route through the Carmel mountain range. This needed to be passed to reach the Jezreel Valley beyond wherein lay Megiddo. The central route, the Aruna road, is identified with Wadi Ara or Nahal Iron. This 20-kilometre long valley begins at the modern city of al-Farm, ancient Aruna, and has been identified with the Via Maris, the most important route from Egypt to Syria and from the Mediterranean lowlands into the valley of Kishon and from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the north, although this route has also been conjectured passed through the southern route via Dothiam and exiting at Tanakh. The location of Tanakh has been identified as the tell close to modern Palestinian village of Tjaneni, 13 kilometers northwest of the city of Jenin in the West Bank. The proximity of this site to Jenin informs us that the sites of Thutmose's battle were north of most of Allenby's initial fighting. The securing of the passages through the Mount Carmel range on 20th of September 1918 were achieved after the initial breakthrough by Allenby's forces, whereas Thutmose marched through the Mount Carmel range and then fought his battle. Jifti or Zefti on the northern route is identified as Tel Yokneam or Yokneam or Tel Huamum, located near the modern Israeli city of Yokneam Ilit. There is more going on in the annals, however, which we will come to, but these factors too seem to have played their part in Allenby's choice to call his battle Megiddo. It would seem that this message of avoiding the difficult road was one the army had presented to their pharaoh before. Thutmose's response, however, was that he would proceed along the difficult Aruna road. He told his assembled army, "Let him of you who wishes to go on those roads you spoke of, let him of you who wishes come in my majesty's following." On the one hand, this seems to be Thutmose calling his army's bluff, and on the other, that he knows better and that they should trust in his judgment. And of course, the army calls out that they will follow their pharaoh and go where he leads. Thutmose therefore told his army that he would lead them, personally going at the front of the advance. There is not account of scouts or messengers in the inscription, but Thutmose must have sent scouts ahead to know his choice was safe. He may even have sent false deserters to tell the enemy of his intended route of march. That information was a lie. However, it was achieved. Thutmose knew that the central, dangerous route would be unguarded, and so took it even against the advice of his own army. 3 days later, on the day 19 of the month, the army set out northwards towards Megiddo, Thutmose leading them. Coming out of the pass, they met not a single man of the enemy, but saw that the enemy was massed with a wing guarding the 2 other routes, the southern wing at Tanakh and the northern wing at the Quina Valley. It seems unlikely that the enemy would not guard the central shortest route at all, even if it was the most difficult, unless they had been misled into doing so. There may be parallels in this to Allenby's highly complex and involved subterfuge to give false intelligence that he intended to attack in the east and not in the west. Allenby had apparently undertaken such measures in October 1917, before the Battle of Beersheba as well. They had not been believed then either. There may well have been false intelligence to play in Thutmose's campaign too, agents and false deserters sent to the enemy at Megiddo to assure them that he was taking either of the 2 alternative routes, but definitely not the most difficult and dangerous central route. Whatever the likelihood of such a campaign, it would seem, at least according to the annals, that the enemy only guarded the 2 alternate routes, and that the difficult central route, the one Thutmose took, was left unguarded. Similarly, if the Ottomans were unconvinced by all Allenby's pretence, as they seem to have been, they still did nothing to strengthen their western defences, and this was where Allenby successfully attacked in force. Thutmose's inscriptions do not, however, talk of any such subterfuge, although we know it was a feature of later Egyptian warfare. If, however, Allenby read the Battle of Megiddo as involving just such subterfuge, that may have been what inspired his own acts of deception in the same combat zone. Most of the remaining parallels between Allenby's battle and that of Thutmose lie in the selection of terrain best suited for his mounted division to exploit the expected breakthrough by Allenby. The battlefield of Megiddo was perfect for chariots and horses, So it proved for Thutmose, and so too it would prove for Allenby. As Thutmose entered the plain by the unguarded Aruna road, Thutmose knew he had won. He called out to his own army, "They are fallen, the wretched enemy." So too did Allenby know that on the afternoon or evening of the 19th of September, the first day of the main attack, that he had broken the enemy. The successes of the following days may have exceeded his expectations, but he surely expected great success. Again, in the annals, there is a twist, however. The army now advised Thutmose to await the arrival of the rear guard, which was still on the road, rather than attack the enemy immediately. And Thutmose listened to that advice. When the rear guard appeared, Thutmose advanced further into the valley and made camp, telling his army that they would do battle on the following day. One will engage in combat with that wretched foe in the morning. This delay might be seen as a blunder, but it might also allow for the fright and demoralization of the enemy, who would have learnt that they had been deceived or made a fateful blunder of their own by either not guarding the central route or by believing false deserters. We might well imagine that any enemy morale had been sapped by the unexpected arrival of the Egyptian force exactly where they had not expected them, and despite a day to reorganize, they were still rattled and broke easily in the ensuing battle. On day 21 of the month, therefore, Thutmose arrayed his army. The enemy had had to regroup their forces to oppose him, placing his southern flank on a hill south of the mouth of the Queen Valley and his northern flank northwest of Megiddo. He arrayed his army in 3 wings. He commanded the centre in his chariot. Actual detail of the battle is slight, but it would seem the confederation of rebels opposing Thutmose broke at the first charge. Then his Majesty overwhelmed them at the head of his army. When they saw his Majesty overwhelming them, they fled headlong to Megiddo with faces of fear, abandoning their horses, their chariots of gold and silver. Despite giving up the element of surprise achieved by his initial arrival, the army of Thutmose put the enemy to flight, seemingly in the first charge, led by the king in his chariot. We might see a parallel of the charge of the Australian 4th Light Horse Brigade on 25th of September 1918, likewise breaking the defence of Samak in a single charge. The enemy fled back towards the city of Megiddo and were pulled up into the city, since the gates had been closed and were not reopened. The annals have one last twist. They tell us that at this point the Egyptian army fell to plundering the enemy camp rather than pressing their advantage. The inscription bewails that if His Majesty's troops had not set their hearts to plundering the possessions of the enemies, they would have captured Megiddo at this moment. The explicit criticism of the army in its moment of triumph, moving to plunder history rather than following up the victory, is unexpected. However, victories throughout military history have continued to be squandered by similar conduct. Some of the annals' best poetry occurs in this passage. Their ranks were lying stretched out on their backs like fish in the bite of a net, while His Majesty's valiant army counted their possessions. The army celebrated Thutmose's victory and extolled his victory. He was presented with the plunder they had taken, hands, living prisoners, horses, chariots of gold and silver. In the descriptions of the prisoners and equipment taken in September 1918, there is a dark parallel with Thutmose's battle 3.5 millennia earlier. The sobering description of defeat will always read the same. Any frustration Thutmose may have felt at his army's turning to plunder rather than following up its victory is masked in the annals. Megiddo needed to be taken and put under siege, although Thutmose exhorts his army to grasp well the point that it needed to be taken. It would take a prolonged siege, perhaps even 7 months. Thutmose, however, realized that inside the city's walls were every one of the northern leaders who opposed Egyptian rule. Take the city, and he could eliminate such opposition in one fell swoop. The capture of Megiddo is the capture of 1,000 towns. This was duly done. The town was measured, and a ditch and wall built of its own fruit trees surrounded it. No one was permitted in or out of the city. The enemy princes begged for mercy. They all offered tribute to Thutmose of silver, gold, lapis lazuli, and turquoise, and large and small cattle for his Majesty's army. All of this tribute was carried south by Thutmose's army. The account in the Annals concludes with Thutmose recognizing the defeated territories. His Majesty's appointed the rulers anew for every town, and a long list of the booty captured. This included 340 living prisoners, 83 hands to represent the dead, 2,041 horses, 6 stallions, and 191 foals, and an unknown number of colts, 924 chariots, including 2 chased in gold, belonging to the ruler of Kadesh and the prince of Megiddo, 200 suits of leather armor, 2 bronze coats, and 502 bows. The text is partially fragmentary when it comes to the captives, although we do know a total 2,503. The extant portion of the breakdown tells us where some of these came from, which kingdoms provided men for the Confederation, belonging to them 38, children of that enemy and of the princes with him 84, Marian warriors belonging to them 5, male and female slaves and their children 1,796, pardoned persons who had come out from that enemy because of hunger 103, total 2,503. In addition to this, there were 1,929 cows, 2,000 goats, and 20,500 sheep were also captured, along with 207,300 sacks of wheat and much else. Once again, there is a parallel in the amount of plunder and prisoners in the 15th century BC and of the detritus of war left after Allenby's campaign in 1918. Again, however, the aftermath of all campaigns is the same, and it cannot have been a parallel sought by Allenby. Nonetheless, he saw parallels between his campaign and that of Thutmose 3,500 years earlier, so much so that he named his battle Megiddo. The most pertinent parallels seem to have been the use of false information to disguise the place of the attack, and in the choice of terrain ideal for horses and chariotry. In both cases, there were indeed parallels between the two campaigns, and we cannot begrudge Allenby his choice of name for his extraordinary victory. Well, thanks, Murray, again for writing that excellent episode for us. If you would like to write an episode for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and please do go along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and become a patron there. Thanks again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.